Today I'm going to be ranking and reviewing the 11 books that were chosen as Waterstones sci-fi and fantasy books of the month in 2024. Bit of a mouthful, but basically for anyone who doesn't know, Waterstones is a bookstore chain that we have in the UK, and every single month that they choose books across different genres that they promote as their books of the month. 2024 was the first year where they did a sci-fi and fantasy book of the month, so I thought it would be kind of fun to read all the books and decide whether I can trust Waterstones book recommendations. I have done this type of video before. I will leave those linked in the description. Last year I read the fiction books of the month, and the year before I read the thriller books of the month. This year was the most successful. I don't think there was any book that I actively hated. There was a few that I found underwhelming, which we'll get into as we go through the video. I do have a stack of some of the books which I own physically, just in case you would like a sneak peek. I also read the rest on Kindle. There were 3 books where I either alternated between the physical and the audiobook, or I read the book physically while listening to the audiobook. If you're interested in a genre breakdown, then 2 of these books are sci-fi, 3 are romantasy, 2 I would categorise as cosy speculative novels. 1 has fantasy elements, however I would argue that fantasy shouldn't be the primary genre, and then the rest are just general fantasy. So we are going to kick things off with the January book of the month, which was Godkiller by Hannah Kaner. The cover for this is absolutely stunning. I can remember when this book came out, I saw the cover and I thought, wow, this is one of my favourite fantasy covers that I've seen in a while. It's also quite short. It's only around 300 pages, which is quite short for adult fantasy. Unfortunately, I found this one a little disappointing. The world was really cool. It's set in this world where there was this war between gods and humans, and some of the gods were also on the side of the humans. However, following this war, the king decided to outlaw the worship of gods, so people are no longer able to worship gods, and that means that the gods are slowly losing their power. One of our main characters is Kissun, who is a god killer, as in the title, and near the start of the book she comes across this young girl who has a god attached to her, and the rest of the book is essentially a travelling story where you're following this group of characters as they're travelling to this destination to try and find answers as to how to separate this god from this girl. I can be okay with travelling stories when there's something else keeping my attention, and I felt like the dialogue in this was kind of flat. There was no banter or warmth or just anything. It all felt very dull and lackluster, so I gave this 3 stars. I mean, I could have gone lower, to be fair. It wasn't awful, but I wouldn't go out of my way to recommend it. The February book of the month was In Ascension by Martin McInnes, which is the first of the sci-fi novels that I have on this list. It's set in the not so distant future, and it follows Lee, who is a biologist. She is recruited by this organisation that is affiliated with NASA because they need her help in developing this scientific research. I don't want to go too much into it because there was a lot to discover throughout this novel. It's basically about this main character who has this opportunity to make a big impact on the scientific world. She also has a complex relationship with her family, and you see how that also impacts her work and the guilt that she feels. Her father was abusive when she was growing up, and her sister is frustrated by Lee's lack of involvement in caring for their mother. There's a lot of layers to Lee's character. However, what I will say is that the beginning was a struggle to get through because there was a lot of exposition, not much dialogue, and even though what was happening was interesting, it did feel quite dense. It's also heavy on the science, and I'm not convinced that I followed everything. I don't think I was meant to be fair. Some things are left ambiguous and you don't get clear answers on everything. It was one of those situations where I got to the end and I felt underwhelmed. We'd had this incredibly slow build-up where my intrigue was so high, but the ending I don't think was as impactful as I expected it to be. I did have a quick look online, and my understanding is that people have different interpretations of the ending. Some people agreed with me and some people had a completely different interpretation. What I did enjoy was how this reminded me of several movies that I like, including Interstellar and Arrival. So if you liked those movies and you're looking for something that has a similar vibe, then this could really work for you. In terms of my rankings, I would put this above Godkiller, but I don't think it's going to stay super high. For March, we have The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. I actually read this when it came out, so I didn't read it specifically for this this challenge. I was so excited for this book because the David Bad trilogy by Shannon Chakraborty is one of my favourite series of all time. This is an adventure story. We're following this main character, Amina, who is a retired pirate. So during her glory days, she was formidable. She was one of the most famous pirate captains that sailed the seas. Everyone knew her name. However, 10 years ago, she retired and withdrew from the spotlight in order to raise her daughter. At the start of the book, she is approached by someone who is offering her a lot of money to do one last quest, and we're following her as she gets the band back together and sets off on this adventure, and I loved this so much. It has a very different vibe to the David Bad trilogy. This is more fun, whereas I think the tone of the David Bad trilogy is much more serious. It's written in a really interesting way as well, as if Amina is telling her story to a scribe who is writing it all down and documenting it. It did take me a while to get used to that because there are parts where the characters break the fourth wall, and that's something that doesn't usually work for me. It usually jolts me out of the story and makes me very aware that I'm reading a book. However, it somehow worked in this book, and I have a feeling that this is going to be a series. If you're looking for a fun historical fantasy that's following an older female main character, then I would really recommend this one. It wasn't quite a 5 stars. I think I gave it a 4.5, but for now, this is going at top of the list. Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros was the April book of the month, and this is an extremely popular romantasy. I'm sure that most people watching this will have heard of it by now. Saying that, I actually came across a thread on Reddit recently where someone had picked this out in a bookshop, hadn't heard of it before but looked it up on Goodreads, saw it has a ridiculously high average rating and decided to read it based purely on that, and they did not like it, which this is not a criticism of that person. I completely understand that that's how a lot of people find books to read. However, I think with Fourth Wing, it is very important to acknowledge that the reason this book became so popular is because there is a huge audience of people out there who are looking for fantasy that has the plotting, the pacing, and the tropes that are commonly found in YA, with slightly older characters. I think the characters in this are in their early 20s, and it has a spicy romance, and there is a huge audience of people who are looking for exactly that, and this delivers it. Objectively, there's a lot that you can criticise. I can remember coming to a part where the main character, conveniently when she's in a stressful situation, she recites her textbooks. I can remember thinking, wow, I am suddenly very aware that I am reading a book. It really took me out of the story and it felt very clunky. The way that the world building was done was not the best. However, I had so much fun reading this. It felt very nostalgic because it reminded me of a lot of books that I read when I was growing up. For anyone who doesn't know, this is about a main character who is at this military school where she is training to become a dragon rider, and the dragons were just so much fun. There was never a boring moment, and I really enjoyed that. So this for now is going to go somewhere in the middle. By the end of this list, it's probably going to drop to near the bottom, but I really enjoyed this, and I think there's a reason it's popular because there's so many people who are looking for this type of fantasy. The Ferryman by Justin Cronin was the book of the month for May, and this is the second sci-fi on the list. This I would recommend actually if you're new to sci-fi and if you're looking for places to start. I found this very easy to digest and follow. It almost felt like a movie. I could imagine this being adapted. Imagine you are Jim Carrey's character in The Truman Show and you're starting to feel like something isn't right about the world around you. That is the vibe of this book. We're following a main character who works within the government of this society. So the way that the world is laid out, you have these 3 islands. You have the one island where privileged people live. There's a second island where their support staff or servants live. And then there's a third island where people are sent once they reach the end of their lives. No one quite knows what happens there. It's all a bit mysterious. But what they do know is that people return to this island born again as teenagers with no memory of what their previous lives were. As I said, our main character works for the government in the department that is responsible for getting people to this ferry that takes them to this island. I didn't love the action scenes in this. I think if I were watching this as a movie, then I would have enjoyed it a lot more. There was also a part in the middle that made me feel really confused and uncomfortable. I think that was deliberate, but I still didn't enjoy reading it. One of the main themes in this is to do with privilege and class differences, and I thought that could have been explored with a little more depth. However, the way that this all came together in the end I thought was clever. It took me by surprise. Not my favourite sci-fi of all time, but a solid 4 stars, and I would put this probably somewhere in the middle of the list. Serpent and the Wings of Night was the June book of the month, and this is another romantasy. However, this one is dark and brutal, and I loved the romance in this. I've really struggled with romantasy over the past year because a lot of romantasy I've felt hasn't really focused on developing the relationship in a convincing way. If it's not a slow burn, then I don't want to know, but this was the perfect slow burn, and the tension between the characters I thought was done really well. It's dark, it's brutal, and the stakes feel high. We're following this main character who is the human daughter of the Vampire King, and she is taking part in this tournament where the winner is going to be granted a wish from the goddess of death. This tournament is extremely dangerous because she is human and she's up against vampires that are much stronger than her. So she forms this alliance with a guy who is the love interest, as you can imagine. I loved the balance between the plot, the politics, and the romance. Even if you were to take out the romance, I think the plot in this is still engaging. However, what I think Carissa Broadbent does so well is the events that happen within the plot are there to push the characters together and where you can see their relationship developing. I have since continued this series because the ending to this is so intense, it makes you immediately want to pick up book 2. There are going to be 6 books in this series in total. However, it's going to be structured as a series of duologies. So the first 2 books do complete this couple's story, just in case you don't want to continue right away. I loved this, and for now I'm going to place it at the top of my list. We'll see if it's still there by the time we get to the end of this video. The next book I have to talk about is Inkblood Sister Scribe by Emma Tors. This was the July book of the month. However, I had actually already read this before the start of the year. I read this because I got it through a Goldsborough subscription a couple of years ago, and I can remember I did enjoy it. It's a book about books, and I love books about books. We're following 2 sisters whose father is killed by a book that is in his collection. So this family is responsible for protecting this magical library. One of the sisters, after her father's death, decides to follow in his footsteps and become the caretaker of this library. The other sister leaves their hometown and travels the world, never staying in one place for too long. This was a really fun adventure. It is a little bit slow in the beginning because it's taken its time to establish the characters. However, once I got to the second half, I flew through this. The only thing I will say is that because it's a standalone, there were parts where I felt like I was just having to roll with it and where there wasn't enough time to really sit and see the characters process their thoughts and feelings. The characters didn't have a lot of depth, in my opinion. I think, again, because this is a standalone, it felt like each character had a few characteristics to distinguish them and to develop a sort of a personality, but otherwise I haven't really remembered these characters, and I am someone who usually loves sister relationships in books. I did think that this was a clever mystery, and I loved the hint of magic and adventure. This is another book that I could see working really well as a film. The ending had me gripped, and so it left me with a really positive feeling, and I would put this somewhere near the top of the list. Now, there are 2 books on this list that I'm going to be talking about together because the August book of the month was The Delegate Dream Department Store by Mi Lee, and the November book of the month was the sequel, which is called Return to the Delegate Dream Department Store. I told myself when I started this challenge that if I didn't like the first book, then I wasn't going to bother continuing with the second. However, I really liked the first book, so I did read the second in December, and this was really cozy. I would recommend this if you like cozy fantasy. I am a little annoyed that Waterstones decided to choose a sequel for one of their books of the month, because this is not a series where you can read book 2 if you haven't read book 1. I mean, you could, but book 2 follows on from book 1, so to me it doesn't really make much sense. You might as well start with the first book. As I said, this does have a cozy fantasy vibe, and it follows a woman called Penny who starts working at this department store that sells dreams. So imagine when you fall asleep before you start dreaming, you go to this in-between realm where there are stores that sells dreams, and this is really a book about the concept of dreaming. It's about the different types of dreams that people can have. You also get to know the people that work in this realm and the people who create these dreams. There was a chapter in the first book about grief that made me sob, so I gave the first book 5 stars. The second book I did enjoy, however not quite as much. The second book focuses on complaints and people who are complaining about the dreams that they have. It's really about mental health and how mental health impacts dreaming, depression in particular, and I thought that it could have been explored in a little more depth. From what I gather, this is now a completed duology. I don't know if there are going to be any more books. However, this is translated fiction. It was originally published in Korea, so I'm imagining that if there are going to be any future books, then they'll come out in Korean Korean first. However, I will be looking out for other books because I really enjoyed both of these books. They're quite short as well, only around 250 pages, so they're quite easy to fly through. I don't think I would have read these books if it hadn't been for this challenge, and the first book in particular really impacted me emotionally, and so for that reason I have to put them close to the top of the list. September's book of the month was Feybound by Sarah Al-Arifi, and this was a disappointment. It is so difficult to find diverse romantasy books, and I was so excited to pick this up. It follows these two sisters who each get their own romance, so you have a male-female pairing and then a female-female pairing, and I think it was too ambitious to try and develop two convincing romances within one novel. In my opinion, this would have been a lot stronger if it had focused just on one of the romances, in particular the sapphic romance, which I thought had the most potential and that was the most interesting. The characters had the most chemistry. The male love interest I thought had zero personality. I didn't understand why the two characters liked each other. It was an interesting world. So long ago there were these three gods that created three races: elves, humans and the Fae. The elves think that they are the only race remaining on this world. However, these two sisters soon find out that that is not the case. It's so frustrating because I think this book had loads of potential, but it ended up just feeling very average. The characters were meant to be in their late 20s or early 30s, but they felt very immature to me. Overall, I just wanted more depth, and so even though there were some interesting twists towards the end, I would probably put this right near the bottom of the list, probably above Godkiller, because I think I enjoyed the world in this just a little more. The final book that I have to talk about is Starling House by Alex E. Harrow, which was the October book of the month, and I think it was a good choice for October because it does have those gothic vibes, and I thought the atmosphere was the strongest thing about it. I don't think this should have been marketed as fantasy. I think this should have lent more into the gothic horror genre. I don't think the fantasy elements were that strong. So this is following a main character. I think she's in her late 20s, but she has a teenage brother who she is the sole carer for. It's set in a small town and there's a lot of mystery within this town. There's this house called Starling House and there's a lot of rumours about the people who manage and run this house. There's different legends that have been passed down through the years and I really enjoyed learning about those and trying to piece everything together. The main character had an interesting backstory, however I did think that her thoughts felt a little bit erratic and all over the place. There's also a romance which I found a little overdramatic for my personal taste. I did think the ending was satisfying and it had some interesting themes, however I wish it had explored them with a little more depth. I would recommend this if you are looking for something that has that gothic atmosphere. It wasn't anything special to me though, and so I would put it probably closer to the bottom of the list. That does bring me to the end of this video and the end of this list, so thank you for watching if you made it this far. If you're looking for my top 3 recommendations, I would recommend Serpent and the Wings of Night if you're looking for romantasy, The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi if you're looking for a fun pirate adventure fantasy, and then The Daligot Dream Department Store if you're looking for cozy fantasy. That one in particular I feel I haven't heard many people talk about on BookTube, so I would say it's a little more underhyped. I don't know whether I'm going to do this challenge again next year. I am definitely going to pay attention to the Waterstones sci-fi and fantasy books of each month because this challenge has been quite successful. I think my lowest rating was like a 2.5 to 3 stars and I would count that a win. I enjoyed more books than I disliked. So yeah, let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books and if you have any thoughts or feelings on them. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it and click subscribe if you'd like to see more videos from me, but otherwise I will see you next time. Bye.